Joe was waiting for the bus, chatting with his manager over the phone. The manager sounded worried, but Joe reassured him he'd head straight to the meeting spot as soon as his bus pulled up. This wasn't just any meeting, his manager stressed how critical it was and urged him not to mess it up. Joe insisted he understood and told him not to stress out. Before the conversation could go any further, the ground suddenly trembled beneath everyone. A deep, jagged crack tore open in the middle of the road, black and bottomless like a rip through space itself. Pedestrians froze, stunned, silently praying it wasn't what they feared, but it was. From that rift, monsters erupted, pouring into the city streets. One man nearby shouted in panic, recognizing it instantly. "It's a flash!" Flashes were dangerous rift events, dimensional tears that allowed creatures from another world to enter their own. Chaos exploded as people scattered. Screaming, someone nearby urged the others to report the incident immediately, though the panic made it hard to act rationally. Joe, too, realized he had to run. But just as he turned, something caught his eye. Lying on the ground where the crowd had just been was a little girl crying and calling out for her mother. Joe sprinted toward her, knelt down, and offered his hand. He scooped her into his arms and prepared to flee, but the monsters were already too close. Joe clenched his teeth, bracing for the worst, certain this was the end. Then, nothing. No pain. Instead, a voice rang out, asking if he was all right. He opened his eyes to see his unexpected rescuers, the Awakened. These were elite fighters, specially trained to battle creatures that slipped through the dimensional gates. A red-haired girl, one of them, turned to Joe and the child. She smiled and said they could relax now. Help had arrived. Relief washed over Joe. He was alive. Back at the B office, his boss was anything but sympathetic. The director was already furious, counting down the hours to the critical meeting Joe had missed. He yelled that Joe should have just run the rest of the way, flash or not. Joe listened quietly, biting his tongue as his co-workers whispered about the flash that had opened above the road. At the end of the scolding, the director threw a stack of papers at Joe, calling this his last chance. If the contract wasn't signed by evening, Joe was out. Walking out of the office, Joe vented to his colleague Mike, explaining that he had no control over the outbreak. He even joked, half seriously, that he wished he could be one of the Awakened, earning real money. Mike raised an eyebrow. "You don't start talking about that out of nowhere," he said, suggesting Joe drop it. But Joe couldn't stop imagining it, becoming an Awakened, just like the heroes in his favorite game. Still, Mike called him out for daydreaming. Joe sighed, admitting Mike was probably right. He felt defeated, especially after everything he'd just been through. Mike patted his shoulder and nodded toward the road. "Hey, isn't that your bus?" Joe perked up, shouted a quick goodbye, and sprinted off. It was 6 p.m., and the sun was sinking low. He was exhausted but determined to make it to the appointment. If he didn't, he was sure the director wouldn't give him another chance. But fate had other plans. The ground quaked beneath his feet again. Another rupture appeared, right in front of him. Joe couldn't believe it. Twice in one day, someone nearby spotted him and shouted for him to follow. Without thinking, Joe obeyed. Monsters began pouring from the crack, chasing after them. Joe ran with everything he had, but they were gaining. One of them snagged his briefcase, clawing at it furiously. Joe turned in horror. His important documents were inside. Without thinking, he punched the creature, yelling that those papers were worth more than his life. But it was no use. The horde was overwhelming him. The stranger who had called to him earlier didn't hesitate. He rushed back, grabbed Joe by the collar and yanked him to safety. Just as the iron gates slammed shut behind them, the monsters pounded against the barrier. The man activated a switch. Electric current surged through the gate, shocking the creatures back. Breathing heavily, he turned to Joe and told him the electricity would buy them time. The Awakened would be there soon. Right on cue, several vehicles screeched to a halt near the rift. The Awakened jumped out, surveying the scene. One of them whistled at the sheer number of goblins pouring out of the crack. "Big haul tonight," one of them said. Their leader, known as Fireball Carl, stepped forward and barked out a command. "Get ready to fight." With that, the battle erupted. The Awakened moved like clockwork. Each fighter knew their role. Some summoned lightning from their staffs, tearing through the goblins. Others charged in for close combat, cutting them down one by one. Systematically, the group began clearing the streets, doing what they were trained to do: defend their world from invaders. Carl leapt onto the final pile of goblins, bringing his weapon down with a powerful crash as he landed. The impact released a shockwave that swept through the area, wiping out the remaining monsters. The Awakened fighters finally exhaled in relief. Their battle was over. As the cleanup began, specially designated individuals started collecting the goblin corpses. Joe, observing from a distance, was impressed by how skilled and composed they were. Curious, he stepped out from behind the gate, looking for the briefcase that held his documents. One of the Awakened spotted him and warned him to stay back. They weren't finished yet. Joe quickly apologized, explaining he was only trying to retrieve his briefcase. A member of the group held up a worn-out case and asked if it was what he was looking for. Joe took it, visibly disappointed by its condition, and muttered his thanks. Carl stepped forward, raising a finger as he reminded, "Everyone that awakened individuals were given their powers for a reason, to protect the weak and bring justice back to the world." The others groaned slightly at his usual moral speech. One of them chuckled, questioning how long Carl would keep playing captain. That's when everything changed. None of them saw the blow coming. One of the Awakened was suddenly lifted off the ground, his head gripped tightly in the hand of a massive goblin. The creature's eyes blazed red with fury as it let out a roar that sent panic through the group. Carl immediately rushed forward, yelling for Joe to run and hide, but Joe stood, frozen. Fear locked his muscles in place. He couldn't move. Carl noticed and shouted again, more desperately this time, telling him to flee the moment he was able. Meanwhile, Carl ordered the others to support him however they could. Though confused by his determination, they prepared to act. Carl charged, activating the energy in his twin gauntlets and shouting that he just needed to buy them time. Moments later, Joe watched in horror as Carl was struck down. The goblin loomed over his fallen body and stomped on his head. Joe's mind reeled. The others knew they were outmatched and shouted for him to run. The monster, blood still dripping from its face, slowly turned its attention to Joe. Terrified, he screamed. He didn't want to die like this. He hadn't done anything with his life yet. The goblin raised its club to crush him, and Joe still couldn't move. Then something changed. Just as the goblin struck, a sudden surge of power overwhelmed him. The ground exploded where Joe had stood, but when the dust settled, he was gone. Confused, the goblin looked around and saw him behind a nearby car, completely unharmed. Joe stared at his hands, stunned. A message appeared before him. He had awakened. He was now granted access to the abilities of a true awakened being. Along with that came temporary access to the system's knowledge, meant to orient new users. A voice called out from beyond the electric gate, telling him to run toward safety. But the goblin wasn't done. It charged again, swinging its massive club. Joe saw another message flash. His body would now move on its own due to the imminent threat. Before he could even think, his hand shot out, and a burst of magic erupted from it. The awakened fighters watching nearby assumed he must have been one of them, but none recognized the technique he had used. It was entirely unfamiliar. Joe ducked under the goblin's legs and skidded behind it, quickly raising his palm. He activated a new skill, Flaming Palms. The goblin turned just in time to be hit by a blinding blast of fire, but it wasn't enough. The monster didn't even flinch. Not a scratch. Joe, realizing he needed defense, summoned a magical shield, just in time to block the next brutal swing. Then he spotted something. a sword lying on the ground behind him. He rolled to the side, grabbed it, and noticed it glowing with a mystical blue light. It was enchanted. Now he had a real chance. Joe launched forward with incredible speed, dodging the goblin's next attack. In one swift motion, he sliced through the monster before it could react. He landed behind it and turned just in time to see the goblin's body crack and crumble into ash. Its head, burned and blackened, shattered into dark fragments. A final notification appeared: threat neutralized. With that, the system returned control of his body and powers to him. The Awakened looked on, stunned, as Joe stood there alone among the fading embers. One of them murmured that he might be a duelist. Another speculated that his rank could be even higher. Then the final message arrived. Joe's training was now complete. He was, from this moment on, an Awakened. 2 decades ago, in the year 2000, strange towers suddenly emerged in the capitals of the world. Constructed from materials never before seen by mankind, these towers baffled scientists and governments alike. Whispers soon spread. Some claimed that beings called Deos resided within them. Initially, the towers were controlled by national governments, but as rumors spread, so did unexplained incidents. Outbreaks began erupting around the globe. In response, those chosen by the Deos began to awaken, individuals gifted with power to confront the threats emerging from the towers. These chosen ones became known as the Awakened, and the era was soon dubbed the Heyday. Joe awakened on March 27th, precisely at 1812. That morning he stirred late in his apartment, groggy and disoriented. Scratching the back of his head, memories from the day before rushed back to him. His eyes landed on his tattered suit, proof that what he remembered wasn't a dream. Just yesterday, Joe had faced down a monstrous mutant goblin, and somehow, he had defeated it alone. During the fight, he had moved with terrifying calm and precision, as though guided by something else. When the threat was neutralized, control of his body returned, leaving him shaken and confused. His eyes darted around his apartment. On the floor lay a heavy iron sword. He stared at it, unable to recognize it or explain how it had come into his possession. Flashes of the goblin's savage red eyes filled his mind. Joe turned quickly, fearing the creature might still be nearby. But all that remained was its crude weapon on the ground. Hovering above the fallen weapon were small, glowing blue tablets, low-grade crystals, unfamiliar but clearly connected to the tower outbreak. Joe hesitantly examined his sword again. He still couldn't believe he'd managed to destroy such a beast. Suddenly, voices pulled him back to reality. Other awakened individuals had appeared, calling out to him. A girl approached, shaking his hand and praising his display of magic. Joe, still trying to make sense of everything, barely registered her words. She told him he was different, quieter, and more grounded than most of the awakened mages they'd encountered. Her companion chimed in, suggesting they speak casually. Joe, hoping to steer the conversation away from himself, asked if they needed to help clean up the mess left behind. The girl shrugged. Such destruction was typical after an outbreak, she explained. Joe, however, couldn't accept that. The sight of death and ruin wasn't something he could just get used to. The group then surprised him with a request. They wanted Joe to lead their team, believing he could train and guide them. But all Joe could remember was how they'd abandoned him earlier, fleeing in panic when one of their own was killed. Now, just minutes later, they acted like nothing had happened. Joe hesitated and asked for time to consider. They pressed him for an answer, but before he could respond, a voice rang. Out behind them, firm and authoritative, a woman stepped forward, flanked by 2 guards. She ordered them to stop pressuring Joe. The trio turned to see her, stunned by her sudden arrival. Joe silently hoped she was part of the administration. Maybe now the others would back off. 20. Years earlier, when the first awakenings began, new guilds had formed to handle the emerging threats. To maintain order and protect civilians, a global institution was created, the Administration of the Awakened. Laura, the woman who had arrived, with the guards, remarked that they'd gotten there faster than usual. She directed the two younger Awakened to accompany her. Meanwhile, Joe took the opportunity to slip away unnoticed. The others quickly realized he was running and, unsure what else to do, chased after him. One of the uniformed men asked Laura for instructions. Without looking back, she simply said, "To retrieve the runaways." Moments later, Joe's would-be teammates were on the ground, their arms restrained. One of the agents turned toward Joe and asked what they should do with him. Laura knelt, picked up his briefcase, and answered that it wasn't necessary to arrest him. She studied his documents, then told Joe they would inevitably meet again. Joe awoke with a start, his alarm blaring, his head throbbed. He couldn't help but wonder if his boss would believe the absurd truth, that he couldn't sign the contract because he had become awakened. Trying to ground himself, Joe slapped his cheeks, twice. He had to move on, still unsure how to harness.
His abilities, he figured the first step was understanding them. Opening his interface, he began reading about awakened powers, a kind of game-like system displayed in blue windows.
It outlined special abilities and stats, each rated by level. His rank was listed, along with all his attributes. Most were at level 5. His magic sat at 3. Something about it felt familiar. He scanned the table of contents and suddenly remembered. It resembled the character class system from his favorite game. Shocked, he realized he had somehow combined 3 classes, just like his original in-game build. In the Awakened world, those with 2 classes were called Double Awakened, extremely rare and highly valued by guilds. Joe had 3. He was a Triple Awakened. Excitement overtook him. He clenched his teeth and raised his arms, shouting with joy. His cry echoed through the apartment walls. Seconds later, a neighbor banged on the wall, telling him to keep it down. Joe muttered an apology, slightly embarrassed. He knew rushing into a dungeon would be foolish. Many Awakened died on their first attempt. He needed to develop his skills first. But he also needed money, ideally, without risking his life. Sipping. On a glass of milk, he brainstormed. There had to be a safer way to profit. Suddenly, inspiration struck. He revisited his stats and dug through his list of mechanical spells. One stood out, doubling the maximum level. Joe looked down at the glass. In his hand, he decided to start with that. Joe stepped out of the building and scanned his surroundings. Just a few steps away, a newcomer was getting a crash course on how things operated around here. Men in uniform were trying to recruit him into their guilds, promising support and future opportunities. The rookie glanced back toward the entrance, visibly relieved that they weren't interested in him. Joe figured he felt the same way. It was better to remain unnoticed. He preferred it that way. Being alone suited his plans, which were focused entirely on making money. Back at his place, Joe made another attempt to request magical energy from the noble to duplicate an item. A notification rang out. The duplication was being attempted at the highest level possible for his ring. As a large blue cube materialized around him, Joe watched with anticipation. But the process failed. His current level wasn't high enough to copy such a rare relic. Letting out a quiet sigh, Joe slumped to the floor and examined what was left. A champion's belt, a vintage writer's fountain pen, and Granny's teapot. For now, he slipped on the ring himself. He remembered that with his awakened registration, he now had access to Deus.net. Curious, he decided to look up the ring's value there. The plan was simple. Copy the other items and sell them at auction. Deus.net had become a central hub over the last 2 decades, connecting awakened users across the globe. It was a place for news, dungeon alerts, and most importantly, an auction platform for exchanging rare items. Meanwhile, in a cozy home in Nagoya, Japan, an awakened girl browsed Deus.net. Something on the page caught her eye. She clicked on the listing. intrigued by how ordinary items could sometimes hold incredible wisdom-enhancing power. Popping a candy into her mouth, she murmured that this one was difficult to obtain. Definitely worth buying. Despite the steep price, she made the purchase without hesitation. The fountain pen now belonged to her. Elsewhere, at the White Lotus Guild's top-floor office near Seoul Yen Station, a girl informed a man named George about her monitoring of recent transactions on Deos.net. George raised an eyebrow and asked what she was getting at. She explained that someone had recently listed a rare relic alongside a more common one, both freshly posted and one already sold. George inquired about the seller, wondering if they were a regular. The woman Agnes replied that this was a completely new user with no data in the system. With only one awakened license allowed per login, George asked what that implied. Agnes admitted she found it suspicious. Relics of that caliber didn't just appear, they were the kind you couldn't find even after sweeping through dozens of dungeons. George speculated that the seller might possess a hidden talent for discovering relics. Agnes nodded, saying that while high-grade relics usually moved through the elite Gangnam market, lower-tier ones often popped up through Deos.net. As she stepped out of her bath and dressed, Agnes added that this seller didn't seem like someone who dealt in such relics regularly. George agreed, noting that most people simply couldn't get their hands on such items. He said he'd reach out to the development team for more intel. Agnes thanked him. Back in the park, Joe was mid-exercise, doing push-ups and counting aloud. His goal was to complete 50. Straining through the final reps, he finally collapsed in exhaustion. A notification chimed. Task complete. He'd earned skill points and leveled up to 11, officially reaching the second-tier magician class. Surprised, Joe dusted himself off, marveling at how this world worked like a game. He opened his stat panel and saw that magic was still his dominant trait. As he tightened the laces on his sneakers, he made up his mind. He'd invest in more passive skills. He took off running, thinking he'd need every advantage if he hoped to survive against real monsters. He remembered how in the game, certain spells were essential for every mage. But skills could only be earned through training, so he kept at it. Joe attempted to cast a defensive spell, swiping his finger through the air, but the system notified him that the spell concentration had failed. He wasn't surprised. Nothing good ever worked the first time. Undeterred, he ran further through the park, determined to try again. Another swipe, another failure. 20 attempts in, and he still hadn't succeeded. Nearby pedestrians started to notice him, marveling at how long he could run without tiring. Suddenly, a young boy nearby shouted to his friend, asking where the ball had gone. Joe looked up and realized the boy was chasing it toward the street. Before he could warn him, the boy darted forward to grab the ball, unaware of the truck barreling down the road. Joe didn't think. He ran. Every second mattered. The child had almost reached the ball, completely oblivious to the danger. Joe pushed himself harder, determined to reach him in time. As the truck sped closer, Joe focused and attempted to use the same spell one more time, his only hope of saving the boy. Joe shouted to trigger the skill, planting himself between the oncoming truck and the boy. The impact was intense, the force of the collision almost knocking him off his feet. But he managed to hold his ground, barely, as he activated his new ability. He tried to absorb the truck's momentum, bracing with every ounce of strength he had. A sting on his cheek caught his attention. A small cut had opened up. Surprised, Joe realized the skill didn't offer full-body protection. Still, he looked down at the boy and asked if he was all right. The kid stared up at him, wide-eyed in awe, and asked breathlessly, "Are you a hero?" Joe didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the notification confirming the skill's activation. Another message popped up. He'd earned a new ability. He smiled faintly and assured the kid, "You're safe. That's what matters." Gently, he patted the boy's head before turning to walk away. Bystanders had begun to gather, murmuring in concern and calling for emergency services. As Joe turned to leave, The child tugged at his sleeve, asking him to wait. "What's your name?" the boy asked. Joe hesitated. If he gave a real name, word might spread fast, something he wasn't ready for. He thought quickly, then leaned down and said with a wink, "It's a secret. Let's just say I'm a superhero or something. But keep that between us, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, promising not to tell a soul. Joe reminded him to be more careful near roads, then leapt away and vanished from sight. The passers-by were stunned. None of them saw where he went. One man asked the child if he knew who saved him. The boy shook his head and whispered with a smile, "I have no idea." That evening, Joe strolled down a quiet street alongside a man dressed in a suit, an agent. They had just closed a deal and the agent confirmed everything was in order. He glanced back at the suitcase containing the pen and the belt. Joe watched as his partner closed the case and assured him the money had been transferred. Joe pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. A new notification appeared, and his eyes widened at the sight. His balance now showed a jaw-dropping sum. Over $1 billion won. He stared in disbelief, having never seen such an amount in his life. After a long pause, he looked up and said, "It's all there." The agent nodded, thanking him for the transaction and promising to handle the relics from there. Joe was left standing alone, the night air cool against his face. So much had happened that day. As his stomach rumbled, he figured he'd treat himself to some fried chicken on the way home. The following morning, Joe got off the bus and looked around. He headed to a nearby stop and checked the posted schedule. One of the routes led to the Road of the Awakened. Spotting the number he needed, he realized he had about 15 minutes to wait. Not too bad. As he stared at the sign again, a sudden tremor beneath his feet broke his focus. His instincts screamed a warning. Could it be? Images from his last encounter with a gate flickered through his mind. Then, a man nearby stumbled to the ground. Joe hurried over, asking if he was all right, but the man could barely speak before suddenly shouting, "It's coming from above!" Joe looked up and froze. A crack had opened in the sky above the bus stop. From it, 3 streaks of light shot down like missiles. Spears. They barely missed his head, slamming into the pavement and embedding themselves deep into the ground. These weren't ordinary monsters. Ahead, something emerged from the rift. Joe's breath caught. He recognized the silhouette, an elderly face paired with a youthful body. The figure wore glasses, and something about him felt off yet familiar. This wasn't just any monster. It was him, the one who crafted impossible things, creations no one else could even imagine. Joe's heart pounded. This was the very figure he used to encounter in the game he once played to kill time. "Is that a gnome?" Joe muttered in disbelief. A short, weathered creature stood in front of Joe, gripping a crossbow tightly. Just as tension built between them, a sharp voice rang out from the side. Clara had arrived. She threw aside her coat and unsheathed her sword, declaring that she would be the one to face him. Without hesitation, she launched herself into the air, aiming straight for the gnome. As she closed in, the gnome shouted a sudden command, calling a general assembly. Clara's eyes widened in disbelief as a swarm of gnomes appeared behind him, each one armed and ready. Dozens of crossbows were aimed directly at her. A barrage of arrows flew through the air, too fast for her to dodge. Clara braced herself for the worst, but the arrows struck something invisible and shattered. A glowing blue barrier enveloped her. Shocked, she glanced at her arms. Joe had shielded her using his newly acquired defensive ability. She turned to him in awe, but he snapped, her back to reality, urging her to focus. From above, one of the gnomes dove at her, weapon raised. She instinctively raised her arms, now encased in iron gauntlets. At that moment, Joe activated his magic projectile spell, calling it out loud. Beams of energy shot from him, slicing through the attackers effortlessly. Clara stared at him in stunned silence. "This place is too dangerous," Joe warned her. He suggested she leave immediately, but Clara stood her ground. "I'm awakened too," she insisted. Joe pointed ahead. "You'll change your mind when you see what's..." Next, out of the dust, a massive ironclad monster thundered toward them. A shield in one hand, a hammer in the other, it marched with deafening steps. In the center of its helmet, a burning red light glowed like a furnace. Clara froze. She couldn't move. The fear had paralyzed her. Joe stepped beside her and explained that some high-level monsters could paralyze opponents with fear alone. She asked how he resisted it. He replied that he had faced something similar before and swiftly scooped her up in his arms. Caught off guard, she was still processing everything when they landed. Her rapier slipped from her grasp. "You should take a break," Joe said firmly. "Even with my shield, you're shaken." She nodded, grateful. Joe then asked if he could borrow her sword. She agreed, warning him to be cautious. Her blade wasn't very effective against arrows. Joe examined it closely and concluded it would be enough. With a powerful leap, he vanished from her view. Landing silently on a rooftop, Joe peered down. Below, a squad of gnomes had assembled, 10 wielding hammers, 9 with crossbows, and 1 commanding officer. Joe knew charging in head-on wouldn't work. His magic projectile alone wouldn't bring them all down. He focused first on the smaller threats. Activating a coordination spell, he fired a barrage of magical blasts, striking several enemies at once. He landed and surveyed the damage. His attack had proven far more effective than in any simulation. The remaining gnomes took notice and began advancing. Joe traced a symbol in the air and summoned a terrifying illusion. "Come, face the mighty one," he growled. The gnomes paused. One stared at him, and instead of a human, saw a towering dragon with glowing red eyes roaring above him. The hallucination was intense. Though one of the gnomes managed to fire a crossbow bolt that grazed Joe, it was too late. He'd already been taken out by friendly fire in the chaos. Joe understood the power of fear when amplified by wisdom. Illusions could be deadlier than spells. He pulled a small fountain pen from his pocket, smiling to himself, glad he kept a duplicate. But he knew the spell's effects wouldn't last forever. He had to strike fast and eliminate the leader. He targeted the boss and launched another magical volley. The enemy raised its shield in time, blocking the impact entirely. Joe frowned. Clearly, this shield had high magical resistance. He'd need another approach. Drawing Clara's rapier, Joe whispered a plea to nature to unlock the blade's dormant power. The sword shimmered and morphed into a rare-grade enchanted weapon. He took a breath, steadied himself, then rushed forward. The iron behemoth raised its shield again. This time, it didn't matter. Joe's strike pierced through the metal. Like paper, the blade drove deep, straight into the helmet's core. "You relied too much on your shield," Joe said grimly. A gasp went through the ranks as the faceplate of the giant's helmet came loose. It fell away with a clang, revealing nothing. Inside, just empty darkness. Joe stared, stunned. There was no creature beneath the armor, just a void. He had no idea what he had just fought.